Today I want to talk about an idea that's been floating around the jelly known as my brain for a little bit now. It started with the last time I put up a sort of technical video, and that was the gearbox rebuild. And then there was the carburetor rebuild about 6 months ago. And a lot of people said, like, hey, they like those videos, they like the way they were filmed. However, they would like a how-to guide on how to do some of this stuff. And I thought, hey, that's a great idea. I should do that. I should do a how-to guide. There are certain things with old cars that seem to be like a bit of a dark art, and carburetors is one of them. Wiring is certainly another. I mean, if you look at a carburetor like this, stripped down to its component pieces, it's really intimidating to look at all these parts. And when they're together, they seem to be sort of really mysterious and impenetrable. You don't really know what any of these things do. And that seems to be a point of frustration for a lot of people who are into vintage cars and vintage anything, or even just technological stuff like motorcycles and even cameras or whatever. It's the not being able to see the wood for the trees when you're looking at the overall picture. And then when you see it stripped down like this, it's just so intimidating. And so, like, what is it that you really need to be able to see in order to do this work? And the answer is, I've only recently come to understand this myself. The answer is to understand the machine for its wholeness, for not just the parts, not just for the finished thing, but what everything does, is to understand the inner workings or the underlying form of the machine. And once you understand the underlying form of the machine, it really, all the secrets of it kind of open up, and it becomes far less terrifying to work on or to take something like this apart. So that's what I thought I'd do today, was maybe try and shine some light on the underlying form of the Weber DCOE carburetor. So way better than having a step-by-step guide on how to do it. Maybe if you could understand a little bit more of the inner workings of it, then you don't need a step-by-step guide. Yeah, I think having a step-by-step guide for a lot of these things, there's no one way to put a carburetor together. There's many different ways, and you can kind of pick and choose and make decisions as you're going along. And that's what you see with real craftspeople. They're not just following a step-by-step guide to what they're doing. They're sort of actively engaged and making decisions as they go along. Like a lot of master mechanics in that, they often aren't consulting a book or something. They're making decisions about the work that's in front of them as they're doing it, because they have an understanding of the underlying form of the machine, and that's important. So I'm going to try and assemble this carburetor whilst looking at the underlying form. Sorry, I'm being a bit of a nerd on this one. Anyway, so this carburetor is for the white Duetto Spider that's behind me. And when this car came to me, it had one DCOE 27 and one DCOE 32. And it was just never going to work, having mismatched carburetor bodies. So what I've done is gone for a set of DCOE 28s from a 1600 Junior. That's a 1600 engine as well. So it's a good fit. The only difference between DCOE 27s and DCOE 28s is that the 28s have throttle shafts made from steel, and the 27s have throttle shafts made from cheese, which is no good. Yeah, so this is the other 28 that's already done. I'm just going to focus on doing one card because they're essentially the same side to side, apart from the having your linkage here. Just make sure you get that right. Right, so we're going to start off, I think, with the most basic part of the whole thing, which is the body and the throttle shaft. So we'll get into this. So I think this is probably one of the core components, I'd say the core component of the carburetor. The throttle shaft, and then the little cam that actuates this little cam actuates the accelerator pump circuit. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. First off, the cam with the spring. This is a bit of a fiddle. Make sure you do it the right way around. And these throttle shafts are not symmetrical. That little hole there is offset for the cam. So get everything facing the right way. Now, what you have to remember is that these holes are countersunk, and you want the countersunk holes to be on the outside, so you can put the screws in the butterflies when it comes time to do that. The next thing we're going to do is fit this little split pin Right, now the throttle shaft is in for good. Yeah, that little spring on that on the cam comes up to the top of the carburetor up here. And this is like your main throttle return spring. This little plate here, this little guy is what it basically hangs off. Now the throttle is always going to return to the shut position. So on each side of the main throttle shaft there are some bearings, and I like to replace them with new modern ones. Somebody said in the comments of the last video that you don't ever need to replace them because they don't wear out, and that's true, they don't wear out because they only ever rotate 90 degrees at maximum. I mean, like how many times you actually, they don't really get much use at all. However, they do seize up. This is an old one, and this has had, originally they had these little leather covers that would keep moisture and stuff out, but those break up over time and then you end up with this, which is no good. So I way prefer, to buy new ones like this. These are modern, properly rubber sealed bearings that are going to last way longer. The idea, and I mean, like, they're so cheap. These are like $1.50. It's really not worth not replacing them. Yeah, so you have one of these in either side of the carburetor. Right, once the bearing's in, you have this little spring that's meant to retain it, and this little brass cover. Right, that's one bearing done, and it's exactly the same process on the other side. Now this is part of the linkage, and now it's really nice and smooth, and it returns up to the shut position. Yeah, I'm just going to leave this on for now so I can open and shut things. Now, the next system that I want to get into is the Accelerator Pump, which is made up of a rod, a spring, a piston, and then this little retaining clip. The retaining clip goes on first, then the spring, and then this little piston, which you just hook on like that. Now this is all together, it goes so when you stamp on the accelerator or you pump the throttle to start the car, what you're actually doing is pumping that little piston, and that piston's pushing fuel through the accelerator circuit, and it sprays out of these little jets. These are the accelerator pump jets, and they go in here. You can see and then look through here, you can see the jet in there. So every time you step on the accelerator, what you're doing is spraying fuel out of that jet right down the throat of the carburetor. To stop those jets from sucking fuel through just by using vacuum, which they would do, what you have is this tiny little ball bearing, that they live in these holes in their accelerator pump circuit with a little brass weight on top of them. And only when you pump the accelerator is the fuel pressure from this chamber enough to lift that ball bearing out with the weight on top of it and that allows fuel to get through to these jets. If your ball bearing is missing or the weight is missing, a lot of guys don't even know those ball bearings are in here. So they strip carburetors, turn them upside down, the ball bearings fall out, and then they have no idea that they were even there. And they put it all back together without that, and that means your accelerator pump jet is going to be sucking fuel through from vacuum all the time, and your car will run rich and foul plugs, and you will never be able to tune it properly. So make sure that those tiny little ball bearings, got to make sure that these tiny little guys are where they're supposed to be with their weights and not a substitute. The actual brass weights that are correct weights to make sure this all works. They're capped off with these little brass caps. Now, the last part of the accelerator pump circuit is this little valve. This valve lives at the bottom of the fuel bowl, right in there. And this allows fuel to pass into the accelerator pump circuit, but only in one direction. It has a little ball bearing in it as well. So it can suck fuel in, but when you hit the accelerator pump circuit and you build up pressure in there, it can't push the fuel back out. These are magic screwdrivers to fit it. So now you can see the accelerator pump jets inside there, and you can understand that as the throttle shaft turns, that piston actuates, pumps fuel through the whole accelerator pump circuit, lifts those little ball bearings and the weights, and sends fuel to these jets, and it sprays fuel. And that's how your accelerator pump works. The last part of this is these little brass covers. Now, if you look very carefully inside the body of the carburetor, you will see some really tiny little holes. These three guys down here, these are the progression hole drillings. And this one here, this tiny little one, that is the delivery point for your idle mixture. It's metered off by your idle screws. They go up here. And these three little holes here are your progression drilling holes. And what they do is, as the throttle opens past them, they can suck fuel from the idle circuit through, but they don't actuate, they don't have any effect while the throttles are closed because there's no vacuum there. So that's what, from the top, that's what these two points are. The progression drillings can pull fuel through as you're opening up the throttles, and then the idle drilling, which is right here in the bottom of here, that's metered off by these screws, gives you fuel while the throttles are completely closed. All fairly simple. So right. If you look in the back of the carburetor, you'll see quite a large hole there, and that is for the choke. And usually if these chambers are left completely open and it has all the jets in the top, what you'll have is fuel being drawn from the float bowl through the choke jets into these chambers and then straight down with a mixture of air past the butterflies. So that's like your cold start circuit. And how that is metered is you have these big pistons that go in here, and when they're down, they shut that off completely. And when they're lifted, they open them up. That is the next circuit we're going to get into, the choke circuit. Right, now that the pistons are in, last thing on here is to, these are the jets for the choke circuit. Right, now you can see this carburetor is really starting to come together. A lot of the, as you start putting it together, things start to seem a lot less intimidating. These are the last part of the idle circuit, and these are just the idle jets and the jet carriers. And because this is a 1600 Spider, they're jetted to 50 F14 idle jets. So what the idle jets do is they meter the amount of fuel that's allowed into the idle jet circuit. Right, now before I put the main jets in and get onto the main circuit, I just want to install this little piece of threaded bar with some red Loctite on it. This is to hold the jet cover in place. Now the main circuit is pretty simple. It picks up fuel through the it picks up fuel from the bottom of the float bowl. These are where the idle jets pick up their fuel in here, and the mains pick them up from here. And then they pull fuel through the main circuit, which goes through here, in here, through the emulsion tubes, and through these holes in the carburetor. And that's where your main venturi is actually. Your main venturi sits right there and pulls fuel through. Your fuel then flows from that into this hole in the main venturi, and then of course it has a venturi effect, that's why it's named the venturi, that pulls through there and into the engine. That's the main circuit. And the main jet is made up of 3 parts. First is the main jet that limits the amount of fuel. That's your metering jet that allows a certain amount of fuel in. The emulsion tube that has a whole bunch of different drillings to sort of pull fuel and air in different ways depending on the sort of characteristic of the engine that you're going for. Your emulsion tubes do kind of exactly what the name would suggest. They sort of emulsify the fuel into a sort of air-fuel mixture by pulling in air from the top through the air corrector jet and fuel from the bottom, and then it all goes into the, and you have, instead of having just like pure petrol or pure fuel coming out of your main jet circuit, what you have is an air-fuel mixture that's sort of emulsified by these tubes. And the drillings, you can see, this is pretty conservative, F16. Some have a whole lot of different, the science of emulsion tubes is actually quite overwhelming. But in this point, we are going to have a 200 air corrector jet on the top, a 120 main jet on the bottom, and then it's all just held by this little carrier. And that is your complete main jet assembly. And they sit right here. Now, these are called the main venturis, obviously, because they give the venturi effect to the fuel. And these are the chokes. And on this, we are using 30mm chokes. And the choke is really an incredibly important part of the carburetor, which you can change out to give you different performance. So these 30mm are pretty conservative. They're not tiny, they're not huge. They're good for a sort of overall, mid-range performance kind of thing. If you had a smaller engine, like a 1300 or something, you'd have 27s, most likely 27mm or something like that, because a small choke will give you good sort of air-fuel velocity, would be a good word. You can get the air moving pretty quickly, but what they will do is strangle you on the top end. So if you want like a city driving car, a good thing to do is to have like small chokes and kind of tune up the carburetor to work with that. If you want something that's going to be like a real screamer that does, 7,000 RPM all day on the track, what you want is like really, really big chokes. So this middle of the road, 30mm, pretty conservative for a 1600. And yeah. And then once those are in, your main venturis go in. So it's impossible to not line them up correctly because they have this little spring that runs in that groove. And if you, sometimes if this little spring is worn out and or like flat, your venturis will rattle around inside the carburetor and leak quite badly as well. So you want those to be a good solid fit. They've got to click in like that. And we're almost done with the bottom end of this carburetor. Right, this is the rear cover for the choke circuit, and it has these little brass arms that move up and down, and they fit into the slots on those choke pistons. So I suppose they're not really pistons, are they? You put this there, and right, now your choke cable runs along here, and when you pull the choke cable, you tip that, it pushes the pistons up, and it allows the fuel and air mixture through past the throttle butterfly valves. Yeah, you don't want to put too much pressure on these nuts on the end. It's why they have locking tabs to keep them shut. The nuts are pretty loose when you're yeah, when these nuts are in the right position, they're actually pretty loose, so you have to just fold those tab washers over to keep them in place. So now that all of this is done, I'm pretty happy with how that throttle shaft rotation feels. You can put the butterfly, or the butterfly valves, or the throttle valves, however you like to call them, you can put them in. And what I like to do is put them in just like one by one, drop them into the shaft. Kind of like, yeah, just like push them around and stuff until they close the really nice consistent sort of gap around the outside. What you don't want is them binding. There's a fairly large amount of play in these holes, so you can actually move that throttle around quite a bit to really find the best spot. Once you're happy with where it is, like I'm happy with it there, drop a little bit of red Loctite into there. Right, so that throttle now shuts. If you let it go, it shuts all the way. There isn't like a little gap at the bottom where it's binding or anything. So, quite happy with that. Now that we're closing up the back of the carburetor, we can put these little gaskets in there. yeah, the last part on the lower half of the carburetor is going to be putting the bottom of the float chamber into place. Fresh new gasket. This is often where, if a car's been standing for a long time, this fills up with like varnish and goo. And little splash cover. You know what they say, sometimes experience is just knowing which hammer to use and how hard to hit. Essentially the entire lower half of the carburetor done, and I think what I'll just do now is put the idle speed screw in as well. Now we're moving on to the top half of the carburetor, and the first thing to do is, whenever you're rebuilding a carburetor, you want to get a rebuild kit that has a new needle valve. And this, of course, meters the amount of fuel that's allowed into the float bowl. Quite often, if you have an old car that isn't used very often and you find it, it like floods and fouls plugs and things like that, quite often there's just dirt and stuff built up on that seat. And some of these kind of wear out as well, so it's a good thing to do. Just make sure this is always new and fresh. It goes right in here. Oh no. Now that the needle valve is in, you can add the float. And I'm using a plastic float in these carburetors, and I'll get to that in a different video. It's quite a complicated subject, but the plastic floats have a different level that you have to set them to the brass floats. This is the plastic float. These are found on more modern production Webers, mostly the Spanish ones, and these are the original brass floats. And I can do a whole video on why I use plastic floats, and so I shall. That'll be in an upcoming episode. So what you have to do to set these up is hang the float, and you hang the whole top of the carburetor sideways, and then you take a measurement from this surface to there, and that should be 12 millimeters, and then the maximum travel should be 25 millimeters, and this is way out. So we're going to have to bend these tabs to make sure that they do what they're supposed to be doing. So that's the maximum travel set. Now I need to set the actual float level. This one was really close from the factory. 13 millimeters. And that makes 12. So that is now set. So now this can go. There we go. Now this is just the fuel filter that goes in the top of the carburetor. So you actually have two fuel filters in these cars, in Alpha 105s from the factory. The one in the pressure regulator and the one in the carburetor. I always tend to put one in the boot as well, just at the fuel tank. So they go under, that fuel filter lives under there, and then this is the, what's called the fuel banjo bolt, that has some little fiber washers on it that are really an odd size. It's not like you can buy these from the like your local hardware store for some reason. And of course this is where your fuel line going in attaches to. And so there you have it. That is my entire assembly process for rebuilding a Weber DCOE series carburetor. And I hope that if you were like I was until fairly recently, until about 6 months ago, I was actually quite intimidated by the idea of taking one of these carburetors apart and putting it back together. I hope I've been able to, demystify it a little bit. Of course, you do need a couple of special tools if you're going to try and get these apart and remove the throttle shafts. Yeah, there are quite a few tricky things to getting the throttle shafts out of these if you want to rebuild these carburetors. And you can see a little bit of it in my previous Weber rebuild video where I use these tools. This is basically just a piece of brass rod that's 8mm thick and lathed down to 7mm on one end, and another little brass tool with a whole 7mm hole bored into the end of it that kind of allow you to knock the throttle shaft through without damaging it. That's a bit tricky, but apart from that, it's actually fairly straightforward once you have the basic understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. I'm no expert at doing any of this kind of work, but I do like to think that I have a pretty good approach and a good attitude to doing this. So there you have it. That is how, that's my process for putting together a carburetor. And once again, you don't have to do any of those steps in any particular order. You can do whichever circuits whenever you feel like doing it. And obviously there are some things you have to do before others, but overall it's way better to understand what each part does and why it's where it is. And then it makes it way easier to put these things together, because you're not trying to remember, where did that little part come from, what's that supposed to do. If you can kind of understand if you can see the wood for the trees on these, it makes it a lot simpler. So yeah, so these are the carburetors for the little Duetto Spider, and hopefully within the next couple of weeks the engine will be going back into that car. It's it's been a real challenge to put that engine together. It needed a lot of machining work to get it right. Unfortunately, it was, that car had a lot of care and dedication and a lot of love in its past, unfortunately, just by the wrong people. So it's taken a lot of work to put it back together. The carburetors are now ready. The whole bottom end of the engine is built, and the cylinder head is built. I'm just waiting on some pistons for it, and we can get around to doing that. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. If you've gotten this far, you're a huge nerd, so thanks. I am too. Cool. Right. I'm gonna get out of here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.